I'm told that the first 30 seconds of a YouTube video are more important than the entire remainder of your video. No matter how good your video is, if that intro doesn't get you as pumped as a 10-year-old snorting pixie sticks, the whole thing's gonna fail. And this really puts a lot of pressure on me to get you to stick around to watch the rest of the video because, quite frankly, I really like this video. I think it's a good one. But I don't want you to stop watching just because I didn't use some crazy dramatic over-the-top phrases in my intro. You know, stuff like
insane,
biggest and wildest,
my craziest idea ever,
and of course, Warlord Titan. Shit, time's almost up. This video is about painting gnarly space bugs, and it's gonna be insane. To me, the coolest sci-fi bugs look like, well, bugs, not some dude in an alien suit. And while I think many of the new Tyranid models in the Games Workshop range look pretty dang cool, their anatomy looks way too human for me, and I just want my bugs to be gnarly bugs. So when I saw the upcoming Ravage Star Gorkog range, I got really excited. It's just like they amped up how buggy these bugs really are. Dave from Mini Wargaming was kind enough to send me the entire range that they 3D printed at their headquarters because the final plastic models are still in production. And I gotta admit, I was a little bit overwhelmed by the sheer number of units, heroes, and monsters within the range. With any big project, I've found the best way to set myself up for success is to knock out a test model to know you really like the look and you streamline the steps before jumping into painting an entire army. And I decided I'm going to do 2 test models today, one of a small infantry size and one of the larger monsters, so I can see how they'd work best together. I'm also going to use as many tricks and hacks as possible, so I can push the hours on the time-consuming parts of mini painting as close to 0 as possible, so we can actually knock out the entire army quickly once we're happy with our test models. Small disclaimer here, some of the tricks I'm using in this video may seem a bit foreign or overwhelming, but rest assured that they are all completely simple and easy to pull off with not much skill involved, because if they weren't, they wouldn't be quick enough or easy enough for me to want to replicate over an entire army. To start out, I'm going to prime the models black and then do a white zenithal with ink from above to really show me what are the shapes and volumes that I'm going to want to paint later. And for my first step, I'm going to keep that airbrush out and bust out some inks. Now, there are a lot of different brands of inks on the market, some from miniature hobby companies, but my favorite are these artist grade acrylic inks. And you can often get them pretty cheap at your local craft stores, as they often have coupons on their website or in a little flyer when you enter the shop. If you don't own an airbrush, you seriously need to consider getting one, especially if you paint a lot of models. I did a whole video showing a cheap intro all-in-one option, and it's great to get you started and get your feet wet. Nothing today that we're doing requires any level of high skill, and that cheap airbrush can knock all of this out. Now, the big key with inks is that they're extremely vibrant, so we get a big punch of color while still having a level of transparency in many of the colors. Meaning we get to still see all that zenithal that we laid down and really have the punchiest version of the inks in the areas that we covered in white while still maintaining our shadows. And this step is super fast. Our goal is to get down our main colors. It's not about being precise. Spray just a little and move on to the next section. If you hose down one section too much too quickly, you'll flood the surface and the ink or paint will run all over the place and not stay on those raised surfaces where you want it. I always work with my lighter, brighter colors first. That way when I come in with more rich and darker colors, I can decide how much of this bright color to leave behind. If you start with darker colors, transparent inks or paints will have a very hard time showing their true color over the top. So if you really want those bright colors like yellows to show, you need to start there and then come in with your darker colors, because you're never going to see this yellow if you start with a dark color underneath. The vibrance and power of the colors we're putting down right now are way more important than precision. If we get the colors to sing, we can always worry about how much we want to clean them up later. With our inks done over the main sections of the model, I'm going to go back in and just spray down some base coats of transparent shade paints over a couple other areas like the flesh, as well as this barf of bug eggs that our giant monster is spewing out. These colored washes are great because you can work fast and overspray isn't really a concern. If you hit some areas that you've already painted, it just tints them slightly and it gives the appearance that they have an interesting shadow color. If I want to make a very impactful army project, I want to make sure that every time I bring out this paintbrush, I'm going to use it as quickly and as sloppily as possible because I don't have time to get really exact. So here we're just going to speed highlight some upward facing surfaces of the skin with whatever bottle of skin paint I saw first on the rack. I just want to define the raised shapes of the flesh as quickly as I can. And you could certainly use a dry brush here, especially for the bigger models. But I find that in situations where I'm in tight spaces, like a lot of the smaller infantry models, and I just want to draw some fast lines, that this step is really best with a standard brush because I can create those lines and textures much faster in just one coat. Speaking of one coat, when I'm doing steps like these, I'm not thinning my paint at all. The goal is that one quick coat of paint will give enough opacity that I don't need to worry about it just fading away and needing 2 or 3 thin coats. One trick that's tragically underused in our hobby, which I used to use all the time and for some reason I must have forgotten about, is of course the oil wash. Once you mess around with oils a little bit, you realize there's no reason to be scared of them, and they can offer so many great things in our hobby. The big thing you need to remember is that when you thin them down, you don't use water, you use mineral spirits, and when you're cleaning your brushes after using them with oil paints, you use that same mineral spirits to clean the brush instead of water. I just buy a big jug of odorless mineral spirits on Amazon for pretty cheap, and even when I use a lot of oil washes, this thing will last me a year or 2. When it comes to mixing my oil washes, I like a consistency of that about skim milk. It's going to be thicker than water, but it's not going to be so thinned that it looks like dirty paint water. I just slop the oil wash all over any section of the model that I want that color, just like I would with any acrylic wash. And since I already used an acrylic wash in this project, you're probably asking, why don't I just use that instead of an oil wash? Well, hold your damn horses, I'm going to tell you why right now. First off, and this is something I do not think is talked about enough, oil washes create a much more even layer all across the surface, meaning there's no uneven drying, no tide marks, no darker splotches that we always see on acrylic washes and contrast paints. Next, they glide easily over the entire surface of your model and down into every crack and crevice incredibly smoothly, meaning you spend less time applying them for a much better looking finish. Finally, and most importantly, they're so much easier to work with to get the exact final effect you want because you can do so with subtractive painting. That just means that once you've applied the wash, you have a lot of working time to go back in with a Q-tip or a small makeup sponge and remove the wash from the areas that you don't want it to lay. So we're just putting down the paint and subtracting it from the areas we don't want it to be. And oil washes have a much longer working time than acrylics, meaning we're in no rush to get that final effect, and we can create these nice smooth transitions from our original acrylic highlights underneath down to nice interesting shadows with our oil wash. As a side note, doing the subtractive method with Q-tips on an oil wash is one of the most satisfying things you can do in all of miniature painting. Today's video is brought to us by Ravage Star, a new tabletop miniatures war game brought to us by Mini Wargaming and Lazy Squire Games. Just last year, Ravage Star burst onto the scene, laying the groundwork for something really big with their first set of 32mm hard plastic heroic scale miniatures. And that something big is just about to happen. Starting November 7th, the official Ravage Star tabletop miniatures game launches on GameFound, and with it comes 2 new factions, the Amari and the Gorkog. They're the bugs. As you can tell from today's video, I'm a big fan of the gnarly aesthetic of the xenomorphs in this game, and all the miniatures seem to have a great attention to detail that really makes them pop on the table. They also have a fun painting competition you can participate in, where you can 3D print one of their models at home for free, paint it up, and enter to win some awesome prizes. I'll put links to both the painting competition and the Ravage Star GameFound campaign down in the video description. But you aren't going to want to hesitate, because when this campaign launches on November 7th, it's only going to be live for 8 days 8 hours, 8 minutes, and 8 seconds. I'm not sure why. I think it's a corn thing. So make sure you check out that link down below to the Ravage Star campaign and click the follow button there so you'll be notified when it goes live. Now, if you remove the wash with a dry Q-tip, you'll leave behind a slightly tinted bit of that wash color. But if you add just a touch of mineral spirits to the tip of your Q-tip, you'll remove the wash from any of those areas you touch with it entirely. Because of this, you know that you can clean up any mistake that you've made in any tight areas that you slap the wash in just by putting a damp Q-tip with mineral spirits over those areas and erase the wash and mistakes that you made. Another bonus, when you want to stretch your hobby dollars as far as humanly possible, you can't get much better than a tube of oil paint to make some washes because you use so little of the oil paint in this tube to make a wash. So this entire tube is likely to last you your entire life. I especially like using dark, interesting colors as washes over highly detailed areas on models. I don't want to spend much time defining all of these shapes, nor do I want to highlight all of them when I have an entire army to paint. Now, a big question I often get is, do I use a varnish before or after the oil wash step? Short answer, no, I don't. Once cured, oils aren't going to go anywhere, and you can apply acrylics right over the top without any worry. Same thing with the acrylics underneath before we do the oil wash. As long as they're properly dried for 30 minutes or so, I'm not going to worry about the oils pulling up any of that acrylic paint. Oh, before I forget, I do have links down the video description below to all the stuff I'm using today and all my must-have hobby products, and any of those purchases support the channel at no additional cost to you. Next step, we're bringing back out our paintbrush, and the good thing about this step is it's completely optional. You can do as little or as much of it as you want to spend time on the models. I call this step detail refinement, and if you're doing a handful of models, I'd follow along with what I'm doing here. If you're painting 200 models for an RB, maybe you do none of it or very little of it. But part of the point of doing a test scheme is to see how much of an impact steps like this make to determine if they're worth it while painting the rest of your army. When I'm doing a test scheme for an army like this, I take before and after pictures with my phone of each step of the process. That way I have side-by-side comparisons to see how much of an impact each of these steps made. And if they didn't do a lot, well then maybe I need to alter it or just scrap the step entirely. When I'm doing these detail refinements, I'll only ever use bright colors. If I'm going to take the time to define an edge or a shape, I need to make it really stand out in one coat of paint, and I need to make an immediate impact. A big tip that I learned that I want to impart to you is when you get to this step in your painting, do not use 8, 10, 12 or more different paint colors here. Only use a couple, because every different paint color you use is going to add more hours to your entire paint project, and it's not going to make that much of a difference. On these guys, I only used 4 colors: a bright skin tone for the fleshy bits, a vibrant yellow to edge highlight the brightest parts of the chitin, a rusty orange for those areas that aren't as bright as the yellow, and then a cool gray to edge highlight my black areas around the shell. All right, we are in the home stretch, and I've got a couple of big tricks still up my sleeve. But before we do that, there's a couple areas of the model that really need to have a few details just knocked out with a single base coat. And those areas are just the teeth, the claws, and the horns. I give them one thick base coat and maybe one quick edge highlight each. And honestly, all of the little smaller horns and teeth on the little models, like our Beetle Boy here, would just be fine with that single base coat to define the surface. Okay, some final tricks to push this thing over the top. When I'm doing eyeballs for monsters and such, I like to use these liquid enamel pigments. They're super vibrant, they're super bright, and I don't have to worry about being exact and detailed about smashing them in there. You just place the paint, then use a Q-tip to fade out the edges or add a little bit of mineral spirits and remove it from the areas where you screwed it up at so you can just get the eye painted and not anything else. Next, we're going to create some very easy yet really impactful effects with glowing fluorescent paint. Our big bug is spewing eggs, and he has these big bulbous eyes that make his body look like a blimp, and I want to accentuate those. And I'm using the airbrush here because the overspray actually gives us that haze of glow on the adjacent areas, and we can even go back and forth with white ink and extra layers to really boost up this effect more. The final fun effect we're going to use is to bust out these new AK Interactive liquid enamel weathering pigments and slap them all over the base. These things give us that wonderfully matte, dusty look once they're dried, but also are easier to apply, and they have a fixative included in the liquid, so the final effect looks like you did something much more time intensive than you actually did. And if you want to remove some, or you made a mistake where you put it, well, guess what? We're going to go back to that same magical liquid we've been using all video and mineral spirits, because we can clean this stuff up, we can remove it, we can haze out the edges, all we want with this stuff with just mineral spirits and a Q-tip or a brush. Well, we did it, folks. Our test schemes are complete. And every time I go through this process, I just have so much fun because I get to use all these tips and tricks and hacks and maybe experiment with new ones to really feel like I've accomplished a lot and feel confident or know what I want to change by the time I apply it to an entire army. For these bugs, I like the warm transition from yellow to orange to burnt umber. Our bugs have a color scheme that really kind of feels like a real insect we'd find out in the wild, but it can change to be whatever colors you'd like best for your own unique take on this scheme. Thanks for hanging out today. I always appreciate you being here and subscribing to the channel. You know what? I just love painting monsters. I love the organic shapes. I love the free-flowing nature. I love not having to paint all sorts of tiny little details like backpacks and belt pouches and buttons on everything. But what about you? Do you prefer painting big monsters and weird things, or do you prefer the standard Space Marines or regular dudes? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're down there, check out the video description. You can see how you can support me if you like what I do here, like joining my Patreon, where those wonderful patrons do all they can to help me keep making these videos, and they get some awesome rewards. You can also pick up all the great gear that I use, oftentimes at a great discount, so you save money and you support me, and you can pick up some Ninja merch while you're down there. I'm going to be back here again next week for another video, and you're going to like it. And sometime between now and then, make sure you find time in your day to slay the gray.